It was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon, one of those mundane days where nothing extraordinary happens. The father stood by, smiling softly as he watched his son laugh and play at the park. The child's carefree innocence was the kind of thing every parent treasures. But all it took was one man, one uniform, and one twisted sense of power to turn that peace into chaos. "Hey, kid, get over here," the voice was sharp, commanding, and reeked of disdain. The boy froze. He had done nothing wrong, yet the tone pierced through his youthful confidence like a knife. His father stepped forward, alarmed but composed. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone steady but edged with confusion. The officer didn't even spare him a glance. Instead, he focused on the boy, his eyes narrowing as if he'd uncovered a criminal. "This one looks like trouble," the officer sneered. Before anyone could react, he reached out and pinched the boy's arm, hard enough to leave a mark. The boy winced, tears welling up in his eyes. "Answer me when I talk to you," the officer barked. The father's chest tightened. He felt a fire rise inside him, but he knew he had to stay calm, for now. "Let him go," the father demanded, stepping closer. His voice was firm, but the officer didn't back down. He smirked, looking the man up and down as if sizing him up. "Teaching him young, huh?" the officer said with a venomous chuckle. "You people never learn." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. The boy clung to his father, his small body trembling in fear and confusion. The father placed a protective hand on his son's shoulder, his jaw tightening as he fought to keep his composure. "You're out of line," he said, his voice low but filled with a dangerous calm. But the officer only scoffed, his arrogance on full display. "Out of line? I'm doing my job, keeping the streets safe from elements like this." For a moment, it felt like time stopped. The father stared at the man, his mind racing. He wasn't just angry, he was calculating. The officer saw only a quiet man, someone he thought he could intimidate without consequence. What he didn't see was the steel resolve behind the father's eyes, or the depth of his connections and resources. He didn't see the badge hidden under civilian clothes, the badge that outranked his own. The father took a deep breath, his grip on his son tightening as he knelt to meet the boy's tear-filled gaze. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice gentle. But his mind was already plotting. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the officer strutted away, the father's calm facade began to crack, but not in the way one might expect. This wasn't the calm before a breakdown, it was the calm before the storm. He knew exactly what he had to do. He had seen men like this before, men who believed their power was absolute, their actions untouchable. And he had spent his career dismantling that illusion, one corrupt figure at a time. Later that night, as his son slept, the father sat at his desk, the events of the day replaying in his mind. The sting of the officer's words, the sight of his son's tears, the condescending smirk on the man's face, it all burned like fuel in his chest. He opened his laptop, his fingers moving with purpose. Names, records, connections, he began to piece together a web that would tighten around the officer and everyone who enabled him. But the father knew this wasn't just about one man. This was about sending a message, about ensuring no child would have to endure what his son did. And so, with the quiet determination of a man who had seen too much injustice to let this slide, he began to set his plan in motion. The officer had no idea what was coming. As he went about his days, unaware of the storm brewing in the background, the father worked tirelessly, uncovering every misstep, every abuse of power, every lie that had been buried under years of complacency. And when the time was right, he struck. What happened next sent shockwaves through the community, leaving everyone stunned, not least of all the officer himself. But how does a man who thrives on arrogance and unchecked power react when the rug is pulled out from under him? How does he face the consequences of his actions when the system he relied on to protect him turns against him? This is a story of injustice and retribution, of a father's love for his son and the lengths he'll go to protect him. But most of all, it's a story of karma. What happened to that officer will leave you speechless. Are you ready to find out how this tale of humiliation and vengeance unfolds? Stick around, you won't want to miss this. The Plow of Twist channel stands firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. To every black viewer tuning in today, know that you are valued, respected, and supported. This story aims to shed light on injustice and highlight the power of standing up against prejudice. We stand with you in the fight for equality and justice. Now, sit back and enjoy this compelling story, and if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more impactful narratives. Let's dive in. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the bustling park, its rays filtering through the canopy of oak trees and painting golden patterns on the ground. Children's laughter echoed in the open air, mingling with the rhythmic creak of swings and the distant hum of conversations. Among the parents scattered around the park, one man stood out, not for any flamboyant reason, but for the quiet strength that seemed to emanate from him. His name was Elijah Carter, a man whose calm demeanor often belied the weight of his responsibilities. Elijah was in his late 30s, tall and well-built, with a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. His skin was a deep, rich brown, and his sharp jawline and kind eyes carried a duality, one of warmth and wisdom, yet unspoken pain from battles fought far from public view. He wore a simple button-down shirt and dark jeans, blending in seamlessly with the other parents, yet there was an understated alertness about him. To most, he was just another father enjoying an afternoon with his son. But Elijah was much more than that. Beneath the surface lay a man shaped by years of rigorous training in a career that required precision, discretion, and unwavering resolve. He was an agent for the FBI, though his current appearance betrayed nothing of his professional life. Beside him, 8-year-old Micah Carter ran freely, his laughter filling the air as he chased a stray soccer ball across the grass. Micah was the kind of boy whose energy seemed boundless, his enthusiasm contagious. His curly hair bounced as he darted between the trees, and his bright smile was a reflection of the innocence that Elijah worked so hard to protect. For Micah, this was just another carefree day, an ordinary moment in a life that his father had meticulously built to shield him from the harsher realities of the world. The park itself was a snapshot of suburban America, neatly trimmed lawns, brightly painted playground equipment, and families from different walks of life coming together in a shared space. But beneath this idyllic exterior, Elijah was acutely aware of the subtle divides that lingered in the background. The sidelong glances, the hushed whispers, the unspoken rules of who truly belonged in certain spaces, these were realities he had encountered time and time again, both as a black man and as a father. Today, however, he had hoped for a respite from those reminders. He had hoped for peace. Elijah leaned against a wooden bench, his arms crossed as he watched Micah kick the ball back and forth. He smiled faintly, his thoughts drifting. He rarely allowed himself the luxury of relaxation, but something about these moments with Micah felt sacred. It was a reminder of why he did what he did, why he faced danger and made sacrifices. For his son's future, for the promise of a better world. A sharp voice cut through the pleasant hum of the park, shattering the serenity. Elijah's gaze snapped to the source, his instincts kicking in almost reflexively. A police officer, stocky and middle-aged, with a badge that gleamed in the fading sunlight, stood a few feet away. His face was set in a scowl, his posture rigid with authority. The man's name, as Elijah would later discover, was Officer Raymond Wells. Raymond had been patrolling the area for years. To many, he was just another officer doing his job, but to those who had crossed his path in the wrong circumstances, his reputation painted a different picture. He was known for his quick temper, his heavy-handed approach, and his unapologetic prejudice that seeped into his interactions with anyone he deemed out of place. Elijah watched as the officer's eyes landed on Micah, narrowing with suspicion. The boy was unaware of the scrutiny at first, too focused on his game to notice the brewing storm. Elijah's muscles tensed. He knew that look, had seen it countless times before. It was the look of someone who saw a threat where there was none, someone whose authority was rooted in the belief that it was above question. Raymond took a step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel path. "Hey, kid," he barked, his voice carrying an edge that silenced nearby chatter. Micah froze mid-kick, turning to face the man. His wide eyes were filled with confusion, but not yet fear. Elijah moved instinctively, closing the distance between them with measured steps. "Is there a problem, officer?" Elijah's voice was steady, calm, but there was a firmness beneath it that demanded respect. Raymond barely glanced at him, his focus remaining on the boy. "This your kid?" he asked, his tone laced with disdain. Elijah nodded, his jaw tightening. "He is." "What's the issue?" Raymond chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Looks like he's up to no good. Running around, acting all suspicious. You should keep a closer eye on him." Elijah's grip on his patience tightened. He stepped in front of Micah, his body shielding his son from the officer's glare. "He's playing," Elijah said evenly. "That's what kids do in parks." Raymond's smirk deepened, his hand reaching out to grab Micah's arm. The boy flinched, a small gasp escaping his lips. "Answer when I talk to you, boy," Raymond snapped, his fingers pinching Micah's skin just enough to leave a mark. Elijah's hand shot out, gripping the officer's wrist in a controlled yet unyielding hold. "Let him go," Elijah said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. Raymond yanked his arm back, glaring at Elijah. "You people think you can just do whatever you want," he muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. Elijah's mind raced. Every fiber of his being screamed to act, to push back, to defend his son with the force he knew he was capable of. But years of training and countless operations had taught him the value of restraint, the power of choosing the right moment. He stared at Raymond, his gaze unflinching. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his words a promise more than a threat. The officer scoffed, turning on his heel and walking away as if nothing had happened. But Elijah stood rooted in place, his hands clenched at his sides. Micah tugged at his sleeve, his voice small and shaky. "Dad, why did he do that?" Elijah knelt down, his heart breaking at the confusion in his son's eyes. "Because some people don't see the world the way they should," he said softly. "But we'll fix this. I promise." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park, Elijah knew that a line had been crossed. What happened that day wouldn't be forgotten, and it wouldn't go unanswered. The gears in his mind began to turn, setting the stage for a reckoning that would echo far beyond that quiet suburban park. The drive home from the park was unusually quiet. Micah sat in the back seat, his head leaning against the window, his small hands clutching the hem of his shirt. Elijah glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his heart heavy with the weight of the day's events. He had seen fear before, on the faces of victims, suspects, and even his own reflection during the most harrowing moments of his career, but seeing it in his son's eyes was something he wasn't prepared for. The silence between them felt like a chasm, wide and impossible to cross. At home, Micah sat at the kitchen table, pushing a spoon through the bowl of cereal he had insisted on having for dinner. Elijah leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, watching his son with a mix of sorrow and determination. The boy hadn't said much since they left the park, and Elijah didn't want to push him, but the air between them felt too heavy to leave untouched. "What's on your mind, bud?" Elijah finally asked, his voice gentle but probing. Micah shrugged, his eyes fixed on the swirling milk in his bowl. "Why was he so mean, Dad? I didn't do anything to him." The words hit Elijah like a punch to the gut. He walked over and knelt beside his son, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said firmly, his voice steady. "Some people act out of fear or ignorance, and it makes them do things they shouldn't. That's not your fault, okay?" Micah nodded slowly, but Elijah could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. He felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, not just at Officer Wells, but at the system that allowed men like him to operate unchecked. Elijah had spent years navigating that system, using it to bring criminals to justice, but now he saw it from a different angle. It wasn't just about the law, it was about power, and who wielded it. The next day, Elijah sat in his office, his laptop open in front of him. Files were spread across his desk, a collection of names, dates, and records he had gathered over the years. He wasn't sure where to start, but he knew he had to do something. He couldn't let this slide, not after what Wells had done to Micah. He pulled up the officer's name in a database, his fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard. What he found wasn't surprising, but it was infuriating: a history of complaints, most of them dismissed or marked unsubstantiated. It was a pattern Elijah had seen before, one that screamed of a department protecting its own at the expense of accountability. Elijah leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He knew how these things worked. Complaints alone wouldn't be enough to bring Wells down, especially in a community that was quick to side with authority figures. He needed something concrete, something undeniable. He needed a plan. That evening, Elijah met with a friend, Marcus Daniels, a journalist known for his investigative reporting. They sat in a dimly lit diner, their voices low as they discussed the situation. Marcus was one of the few people Elijah trusted outside of his professional circles, and he knew the journalist's network could be invaluable. "Wells isn't just a bad apple," Elijah said, his tone measured but urgent. "He's part of a rotten tree, and if we don't expose him, this will keep happening. Not just to Micah, but to other kids, other families." Marcus nodded, his pen moving swiftly across a notepad. "You're not wrong, but taking him down isn't going to be easy. These guys cover for each other. You know that as well as I do." Elijah's jaw tightened. "That's why we have to be smart about this. I'm not just going after Wells, I'm going after the system that enables him. But I need your help." Marcus looked up from his notepad, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of curiosity and resolve. "What are you thinking?" Elijah leaned in, lowering his voice further. "I have access to records, things most people can't see. If we combine that with your platform, we can build a case that's impossible to ignore. But we have to be careful. If this gets out too soon, they'll bury it before we can finish." The journalist nodded, his expression serious. "I'm in. Just tell me what you need." Over the next few weeks, Elijah and Marcus worked tirelessly, piecing together a narrative that exposed not just Wells but the broader culture of misconduct within the department. They interviewed former colleagues, gathered statements from victims, and cross-referenced records to build an airtight case. It wasn't just about justice for Micah anymore, it was about dismantling a system that had been allowed to thrive for far too long. Meanwhile, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that Wells suspected something. The officer's presence seemed to linger wherever Elijah went, his patrol car parked conspicuously near the places Elijah frequented. It wasn't overt enough to be called harassment, but it was enough to send a clear message: Wells knew Elijah was up to something, and he wasn't happy about it. One afternoon, Elijah picked Micah up from school. The boy seemed more like himself, his smile returning as he recounted a story about a science project he was working on. But as they walked to the car, Elijah noticed Wells's patrol car parked across the street. The officer leaned against the hood, his arms crossed, watching them with a smug expression. Elijah's blood boiled, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. Back at home, Elijah sat Micah down, his expression serious. "Listen, Micah," he began, choosing his words carefully. "You might see that officer around again. If you do, I want you to stay close to me or another adult you trust. Don't talk to him, don't go near him. Just let me handle it, okay?" Micah nodded, his face solemn. "Okay, Dad." As the days went on, Elijah's plan began to take shape. He had enough evidence to take to internal affairs, but he knew that wasn't enough. He needed the public on his side, and that meant releasing the story strategically, in a way that would draw maximum attention and pressure. He coordinated with Marcus, ensuring that the timing was perfect. But Wells wasn't going to go down without a fight. One evening, Elijah found a note taped to his front door. It was a thinly veiled threat, warning him to stay in his lane. Elijah crumpled the paper in his fist, his resolve hardening. If Wells thought intimidation would work, he clearly didn't know who he was dealing with. The stage was set, the pieces in place. Elijah knew the risk he was taking, but he also knew he couldn't back down. What happened next would either bring Wells and his enablers to justice or expose Elijah and his family to even greater danger. The tension was palpable, every moment charged with the weight of what was at stake. And as the clock ticked down to the moment of reckoning, one question loomed over everything: how far would Wells go to protect his secrets, and how far would Elijah go to expose them? The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across Elijah's home office. Papers were spread out in meticulous rows on the surface, each one a piece of a larger puzzle. Elijah sat at the desk, his elbows resting on its edge as he stared at the screen in front of him. Marcus's voice came through the speaker, steady and resolute. They had reached the final stage. Everything had been set into motion, the evidence compiled, the reports cross-referenced, and the story ready to go live. But there was still one last move to make, one final step that would tip the scales and ensure Wells couldn't escape this time. "Elijah, are you sure about this?" Marcus's voice carried a mix of concern and determination. "Once we hit publish, there's no going back. The department's going to come down hard, not just on Wells, but on anyone tied to him." Elijah didn't look away from the screen, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the desk. "I'm sure," he said, his voice low but firm. "This isn't just about Wells. It's about everyone like him, everyone who thinks they can get away with this because the system has their back. If we don't do this now, it's only going to get worse." Marcus sighed, the sound crackling through the speaker. "All right. I'll prep my end. You better be ready for some fallout, though. People like Wells don't go down quietly." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He wasn't naive, he knew exactly what kind of backlash this could bring. But every time he doubted himself, he thought of Micah's face that day at the park, the fear and confusion in his eyes. That memory was enough to steady his resolve. The next morning, Elijah woke early, his mind already focused on the day ahead. He drove Micah to school as usual, their conversation light and filled with the kind of mundane details that brought a sense of normalcy. But as they pulled up to the school's entrance, Elijah noticed a familiar figure standing near the edge of the parking lot. Wells. The officer wasn't in uniform, but his posture and the smug expression on his face made his presence impossible to miss. Elijah felt a cold wave of anger wash over him, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Micah, stay in the car for a minute," Elijah said, his voice even but commanding. Micah looked up, his brow furrowing with concern. "What's wrong, Dad?" Elijah smiled faintly, trying to mask his unease. "Nothing, Bud. I just need to take care of something real quick." He stepped out of the car, his movements deliberate as he approached Wells. The officer smirked, his arms crossed over his chest as he watched Elijah approach. Well, Wells said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Fancy seeing you here. Thought you'd be too busy playing detective to do school drop-offs." Elijah stopped a few feet away, his hands at his sides, his stance calm but unyielding. "What are you doing here, Wells?" The officer chuckled, the sound cold and sharp. "Just taking a stroll, enjoying the morning air." "That's not a crime, is it?" Elijah's jaw tightened. "Cut the act. You've been following me, and we both know it." Wells shrugged, his smirk widening. "Following you? Don't flatter yourself. I've got better things to do than keep tabs on some overzealous dad." Elijah took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, steady tone. "Whatever game you think you're playing, it ends today. I know what you've done. I know about the complaints, the cover-ups, all of it. And so will everyone else. For the first time, Wells's smirk faltered. His eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. You think you can take me down? Go ahead, try. You'll see how far you get. You think people like you get to call the shots? Newsflash, the world doesn't work like that. Elijah didn't flinch. We'll see about that. He turned and walked back to the car, his heart pounding but his expression calm. Micah looked up at him as he climbed into the driver's seat, his eyes wide with worry. Is everything okay, Dad? Elijah nodded, forcing a reassuring smile. Yeah, everything's fine. Let's get you to class. By midday, the story had gone live. Marcus had published an in-depth exposé, complete with evidence of Wells's misconduct and the department's attempts to shield him. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media lit up with outrage, the story spreading like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying its reach. And as Elijah watched the reactions pour in, he felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time, it felt like the tide was turning. But the fight wasn't over. That evening, Elijah received a call from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering, his instincts on high alert. Carter, a voice said, low and threatening. It was Wells. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? You think exposing me is going to fix anything? You're a fool if you believe that. Elijah's grip on the phone tightened. You brought this on yourself, Wells. You can't hide from the truth anymore. The officer laughed, a bitter, menacing sound. You think this is over? It's not. You just made things a whole lot worse for yourself. The line went dead, but the threat lingered. Elijah stared at the phone, his mind racing. He knew Wells was desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. But he also knew he couldn't back down now. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. As the night wore on, Elijah prepared for whatever was coming. He double-checked the locks on his doors, made sure Micah was safe, and reviewed the evidence one last time. The fight was far from over, but Elijah was ready. He had spent his life standing up to bullies, and he wasn't about to stop now. What happened next would determine everything, the future of his family, the fate of Wells, and the broader fight for justice. And as Elijah sat in the quiet of his home, waiting for the next move, one thing was clear, the storm was far from over. The following morning, Elijah stood in the kitchen, his coffee untouched on the counter. His eyes were fixed on the window, scanning the quiet suburban street outside. The house was still, Micah was upstairs, getting ready for school. Elijah's phone buzzed on the counter, the vibrations sharp against the silence. It was Marcus. Elijah, you seeing this? Marcus's voice was tense, the kind of tension that came from knowing a storm was about to hit. Elijah grabbed the remote, turning on the small TV mounted above the kitchen table. The local news anchor was mid-sentence, her expression serious. The department has issued a statement regarding the allegations brought against Officer Raymond Wells. While they have not confirmed disciplinary actions, the Internal Affairs Division has reportedly launched an investigation. Protests are expected to grow as more details emerge. Elijah watched as footage of Wells, now in uniform, played on the screen. The officer was walking briskly into a building, avoiding reporters' questions. Elijah felt a surge of grim satisfaction. The walls were closing in, but he knew Wells wasn't the type to go down quietly. He could sense it in the man's threats, the way he carried himself, the barely concealed rage that lurked beneath his arrogant smirk. Marcus, Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. He's not going to let this go. Be ready for anything. Marcus sighed on the other end of the line. I'm already getting calls, people digging into my sources. It's getting messy, Elijah. Just, be careful, all right? Elijah hung up as Micah came downstairs, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Ready for school, Dad? Micah asked, his tone lighter than the atmosphere in the room. Elijah forced a smile, ruffling his son's hair. Always, bud. Let's go. The drive to school was uneventful, but as Elijah pulled into the drop-off zone, his instincts flared. Across the street, parked conspicuously under a large oak tree, was a black sedan with tinted windows. Elijah recognized it immediately, department issued. He didn't need to see the driver to know who it was. "Dad, is that?" Micah started, his voice faltering. Elijah cut him off gently. "It's nothing. Just keep your head up and focus on your day, all right?" Micah nodded, hesitating before climbing out of the car. Elijah watched him walk toward the school building, his small figure dwarfed by the crowd of students. He waited until Micah was safely inside before pulling out of the parking lot, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. The sedan followed at a distance, the driver's intentions clear. Elijah drove with purpose, leading Wells to a quiet, isolated area on the edge of town. It was a stretch of old warehouses, long abandoned and forgotten by most. He parked his car and stepped out, waiting. Sure enough, the black sedan pulled up a few moments later. Wells climbed out, his movements deliberate. He was still in his uniform, the badge on his chest catching the morning light. "What's the matter, Carter? Didn't like the audience back at the school?" Wells's voice carried across the empty lot, dripping with mockery. Elijah stood his ground, his posture calm but unyielding. "What do you want, Wells?" The officer smirked, taking a few steps closer. "What I want is for you to back off. You've stirred up enough trouble, and it's time you learned how things work around here." Elijah's expression didn't change. "How things work? You mean letting men like you abuse their power while everyone else looks the other way? Not going to happen." Wells's smirk faded, replaced by a sneer. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Digging up dirt, running to the press. You don't know what you're messing with." Elijah took a step forward, his voice steady but firm. "I know exactly what I'm messing with. A man who's spent his career hiding behind a badge, hurting people because he thinks no one will stand up to him. But your time's up, Wells. People are watching now." Wells laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "You think that matters? You think a few headlines and protests are going to change anything? This department takes care of its own." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "Not this time." The tension between them was palpable, the air heavy with unspoken threats. Wells took another step forward, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. "You've got a kid to think about, Carter. You don't want him to grow up without a father, do you?" Elijah's heart raced, but his expression remained calm. He had faced men like Wells before, men who used intimidation as a weapon, who thrived on fear. But Elijah wasn't afraid. "If you think you can scare me into backing down, you don't know me at all." Wells's smirk returned, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the sound of tires screeching broke the silence. A second car pulled into the lot, this one unmarked but familiar. Marcus stepped out, his camera slung over his shoulder. Behind him, another figure emerged, an agent from Internal Affairs, clipboard in hand. Elijah watched as Wells's expression shifted from smug to panicked. The officer's hand fell from his baton, his posture stiffening. "What the hell is this?" Wells demanded, his voice rising. Marcus raised his camera, snapping a photo. The agent stepped forward, her tone calm but authoritative. "Officer Wells, you're under investigation for multiple allegations of misconduct. You'll need to come with us." Wells's face turned red, his hands balling into fists. "This is a setup," he spat, his gaze darting between Elijah and the agent. "You can't do this." Elijah didn't say a word, his expression unreadable. He watched as the agent read Wells's rights, the officer's protests growing louder with each passing moment. It was a small victory, but a significant one. The system that had protected Wells for so long was finally turning against him. As Wells was led away, Marcus approached Elijah, lowering his camera. "You all right?" he asked, his tone softer now. Elijah nodded, his gaze fixed on the departing patrol car. "Yeah. I'm all right." But as he stood there, the weight of everything that had led to this moment settled on his shoulders. This wasn't the end, not for Wells, not for the fight Elijah had committed himself to. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like a step in the right direction. And that was enough. For now. The ride home was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavier than words. Elijah gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The echoes of Wells's protests as he was led away still lingered in his mind, a cacophony of anger and denial that felt far from resolved. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, his camera tucked away in its bag, his expression pensive. He glanced at Elijah a few times but chose not to speak. He could sense the weight Elijah was carrying, the storm of emotions that needed space to settle. As they pulled into Elijah's driveway, the first signs of the fallout were already beginning to show. A news van idled a few houses down, its camera crew preparing to go live. Across the street, a neighbor stood on their porch, phone in hand, likely recording. Elijah sighed, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. The quiet life he had tried so hard to protect for Micah was slipping away, piece by piece. Inside the house, Micah was waiting at the kitchen table, his homework spread out in front of him. He looked up as Elijah walked in, his eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Dad, what happened?" he asked, his voice small but steady. Elijah paused, glancing at Marcus, who gave him a subtle nod before heading to the living room to give them privacy. Elijah sat down across from Micah, his hands clasped together on the table. "Remember how I told you that sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy," he began, his voice calm but measured. Micah nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving his father's face. "Well," Elijah continued, "today was one of those times. But we did the right thing, and now we have to be strong, no matter what happens next." Micah tilted his head, his brow furrowing. "Is the bad man gone?" he asked softly. Elijah hesitated, the question hitting him harder than he expected. He leaned forward, placing a hand on Micah's shoulder. "He's been stopped for now, but there's still work to do. The important thing is that we don't let fear stop us from standing up for what's right." Micah nodded again, a flicker of determination crossing his young face. Elijah felt a pang of pride but also a deep sadness. He wanted so badly to shield Micah from the world's ugliness, but he also knew that preparing him for it was part of his duty as a father. That night, as the house finally settled into a tentative quiet, Elijah sat in his office, reviewing the day's events. The images of Wells being led away played on a loop in his mind, but so did the memory of his threats, the venom in his words. This wasn't over. Wells might be in custody, but the forces that had protected him for so long wouldn't simply disappear overnight. Elijah knew this fight was far bigger than one man, it was a fight against an entire system, and systems had a way of defending themselves. Marcus's exposé had gone viral, and the public reaction was as intense as it was divided. Social media was ablaze with hashtags and debates, some calling for immediate reforms and others rushing to Wells's defense, claiming he was the victim of a witch hunt. The polarization didn't surprise Elijah, but it reminded him of the uphill battle that still lay ahead. The following day, Elijah received a call from the internal affairs agent who had arrested Wells. Her voice was calm but carried an undertone of urgency. "We've uncovered more than we expected," she began, her words careful and deliberate. "Wells isn't just a lone bad actor. He's part of a group within the department that's been covering for each other for years. Misconduct, false reports, even evidence tampering. It's bigger than we thought." Elijah leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words sinking in. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed brought a mix of vindication and dread. "What happens now?" he asked, his tone steady but serious. The agent paused, her hesitation evident. That depends. We're working on building a case, but it's delicate. These kinds of investigations have a way of turning political. We'll need your cooperation, and it might get messy. Elijah exhaled, his mind already racing with the implications. He had stepped into this fight for Micah, for justice, but now he was at the center of something much larger, something that could upend his life in ways he hadn't fully prepared for. But backing down wasn't an option. He couldn't look Micah in the eyes if he didn't see this through. As the days turned into weeks, the consequences of the exposé became increasingly visible. Protests erupted across the city, demanding accountability and systemic change. Wells's name became a symbol of everything wrong with the department, but it also became a rallying cry for those resisting change. Elijah found himself the target of both praise and backlash, his name and face appearing in news articles and TV segments. One evening, as Elijah was locking up the house, he noticed a car idling at the end of the street. It was a different car than before, but the intent was the same, intimidation. He closed the door, his mind racing. He had expected resistance, but the persistent presence of these vehicles was a reminder that the stakes were higher than ever. Later that night, Elijah sat with Marcus in his office, the two of them poring over the latest developments. "They're not just trying to scare you," Marcus said, his voice low. "They're trying to wear you down, make you second-guess yourself." Elijah nodded, his jaw tightening. "It won't work. If anything, it just proves we're onto something big." Marcus leaned back in his chair, a faint smile crossing his lips. "You're stubborn, Carter. I'll give you that." But even as he said it, Marcus's expression grew more serious. "Just be careful. They play dirty, and they've got the resources to do it." Elijah met his gaze, his determination unwavering. "So do we. And we've got something they don't, truth." As the clock ticked past midnight, Elijah stood in the quiet of his office, staring out the window. The street was dark, the shadows long and deep. He knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about Wells or the department. It was about setting an example for Micah, about showing him that standing up for what's right was worth the risk, no matter the cost. And as the night stretched on, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that the most difficult challenges were yet to come. But he was ready. For Micah, for the countless others who had been silenced or ignored, he was ready to face whatever came next. The morning sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting narrow streaks of light across the living room. Elijah sat on the couch, his phone pressed to his ear as he listened to the internal affairs agent on the other end of the line. Her voice was calm, deliberate, but the urgency in her words wasn't lost on him. The investigation into Wells had unearthed more than they'd expected, and now the pressure was mounting from all sides. Elijah's grip on the phone tightened as he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "So what you're telling me," Elijah began, his tone measured but firm, "is that this isn't just about Wells anymore. It's about an entire network of officers who've been covering for each other for years, maybe decades." "That's exactly what I'm telling you," the agent replied. "And now that the story is public, it's not just internal affairs involved. There's political pressure, media scrutiny, and people within the department who want this shut down as quickly and quietly as possible." Elijah exhaled, running a hand over his face. He had anticipated backlash, but the scale of what he was up against was larger than he'd imagined. "And what about Wells? What's his status?" "Officially, he's on administrative leave pending further investigation. Unofficially, he's a liability. People who once protected him are starting to distance themselves. But that makes him dangerous, Elijah. Desperate people do desperate things." The warning hung in the air as Elijah thanked the agent and ended the call. He sat there for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand. His mind raced with the implications. Wells wasn't just a bad cop, he was part of a system that thrived on silence and complicity. And now, with that system under threat, Elijah knew the stakes had never been higher. Micah entered the room, rubbing his eyes and clutching a small notebook. He climbed onto the couch beside his father, his expression curious but hesitant. "Dad, are you okay?" Micah asked, his voice soft. Elijah turned to his son, forcing a small smile as he placed a reassuring hand on Micah's shoulder. "I'm okay, buddy. Just thinking about some important things," Elijah said. Micah tilted his head, his young eyes filled with a mixture of innocence and wisdom beyond his years. "Is it about the bad man again?" Elijah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah. But don't worry. We're doing everything we can to make sure he can't hurt anyone else." Micah looked down at his notebook, flipping it open to a page filled with colorful drawings. "I made this for you," he said, holding it up. It was a picture of the two of them standing together, a large heart drawn above their heads. Elijah felt a lump rise in his throat as he took the notebook from Micah, his fingers tracing the edges of the page. "Thanks, Micah. This means a lot to me," Elijah said, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled his son into a gentle hug, holding him close as the weight of the moment settled over him. Micah didn't fully understand the complexities of what was happening, but his support gave Elijah the strength to keep fighting. That evening, Marcus arrived at the house, carrying a stack of documents and a laptop bag slung over his shoulder. He greeted Elijah with a nod before setting his materials on the dining table. "We've got a problem," Marcus said, wasting no time. "There's a counternarrative forming. Some pro-police groups are claiming Wells is being targeted unfairly, that this is all part of some anti-law enforcement agenda." Elijah frowned, his jaw tightening. "Let me guess, they're ignoring the evidence, focusing on rhetoric instead." "Exactly," Marcus said, opening his laptop and pulling up several news articles and social media posts. "They're painting you as the villain, calling you a disgruntled citizen who's out for revenge." Elijah shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. Classic deflection. Attack the messenger to distract from the message. Marcus leaned forward, his voice lowering. "It gets worse. Wells has connections in the media. He's leveraging them to muddy the waters. We need to stay ahead of this, Elijah. If public opinion turns, the pressure on internal affairs could disappear." Elijah rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "So what do we do? How do we counter this?" Marcus sat back, a determined look in his eyes. "We double down. We release more evidence, more interviews, more stories from the victims of this system. We shine a light so bright they can't ignore it." As the two men strategized late into the night, the tension between them was palpable but productive. They both knew the risks of escalating the fight, but neither was willing to back down. For Elijah, this was about more than just justice for Micah, it was about holding an entire system accountable. The next day, Elijah received an unexpected call from a former colleague within the FBI. The man's voice was cautious, his words carefully chosen. "Elijah, I've been following what's happening, and I need you to know something. Wells has allies, and they're not happy with you. You're stepping on some powerful toes." Elijah's stomach tightened, but his voice remained steady. "I appreciate the warning, but I'm not stopping. This needs to be done." The man sighed. "Just be careful. They'll come after you in ways you won't expect." The call ended, leaving Elijah with a lingering sense of unease. He knew the risks of what he was doing, but hearing it spelled out only reinforced the gravity of the situation. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not for a second. That evening, as Elijah prepared dinner, Micah sat at the kitchen table drawing quietly. The house was peaceful, but Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that it was the calm before the storm. He glanced at his son, who looked up and offered a small smile. Elijah returned it, his resolve hardening. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on, for Micah, for justice, and for everyone who had been silenced for too long. The next morning began with a sense of unease that clung to the air like a storm waiting to break. Elijah sat at the kitchen table, his coffee untouched as he reviewed the latest developments. The evidence Marcus had released overnight was already making waves. Victims of systemic abuse within the department were coming forward, their stories heart-wrenching and impossible to ignore. Yet, for every step forward, the backlash grew louder. Supporters of Wells and the network of corruption he represented were doubling down, their accusations against Elijah becoming increasingly personal. Micah wandered into the room, rubbing sleep from his eyes and clutching his sketchbook. He climbed onto a chair across from his father, watching him quietly for a moment before speaking. "Dad, are you still mad at the bad man?" he asked, his voice soft but curious. Elijah looked up, his expression softening as he met his son's gaze. "I'm not mad, Micah. I'm just trying to make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else." Micah tilted his head, his brow furrowing in thought. "Do you think he's sorry for what he did?" The question caught Elijah off guard. He leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. "I don't know," he admitted. "But sometimes people like him don't feel sorry until they face the consequences of their actions. That's why we have to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." Micah nodded slowly, his small hands flipping through the pages of his sketchbook. Elijah watched him, a pang of guilt and pride mingling in his chest. He wished he could shield Micah from the weight of all this, but he also knew that teaching him to stand firm in the face of injustice was one of the most important lessons he could impart. Later that day, Elijah met Marcus at a local cafe. The two sat in a corner booth, their voices low as they strategized. Marcus had brought a laptop, its screen filled with documents and news clippings. "We've got momentum," Marcus said, his tone measured but urgent. "The public's starting to wake up, but we need to keep the pressure on. Internal affairs is dragging its feet, and we both know why." Elijah nodded, his fingers tapping against the table. "They're hoping this blows over, that the noise will die down before they're forced to take real action. We can't let that happen." Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "I've got something big, records from the department showing how they've been burying complaints for years. Anonymous source. If we release this, it'll blow the lid off everything." Elijah's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. "That's dangerous, Marcus." "If they trace it back to you, they won't," Marcus interrupted, his expression resolute. "I've taken precautions. The question is, are you ready for what happens next? Because once this goes live, there's no turning back." Elijah didn't hesitate. "Do it. They've had their time to clean this up quietly. Now it's our turn." The decision set a chain of events into motion that neither of them could fully anticipate. That evening, the new evidence went public. Marcus's exposé was detailed and damning, outlining a pattern of corruption that implicated not just Wells but a web of officers, supervisors, and even city officials. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Protests swelled in size, their chants echoing through the streets. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, their headlines growing bolder with each passing hour. At home, Elijah watched the chaos unfold from his living room. The TV flickered with images of the protests, interspersed with clips of reporters analyzing the scandal. Micah sat beside him, clutching his father's arm as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. "Is this because of us, Dad?" Micah asked, his voice tinged with both awe and apprehension. Elijah turned to him, his expression serious but reassuring. "It's because of the truth, Micah. And sometimes, the truth makes people uncomfortable. But it's always worth fighting for." As the days went on, the pressure on the department grew unbearable. Internal Affairs was forced to escalate their investigation, suspending multiple officers and launching audits of past cases. Wells, now officially in custody, was at the center of it all. But the man who had once carried himself with smug confidence was beginning to crack. One afternoon, Elijah received a call from the Internal Affairs agent. Her voice was tense but laced with an undercurrent of triumph. "Wells is talking," she said. "He's trying to cut a deal, spilling everything he knows to save himself. He's implicating people higher up, names we didn't expect." Elijah's heart raced as he processed the information. "And what about the others? The ones he's exposing?" "They're panicking," the agent replied. "We've already had one resignation, and I suspect more are coming. This could be the break we need to dismantle the whole network." The news was a turning point, but it also brought new challenges. The higher the stakes, the more desperate the opposition became. Threats against Elijah and Marcus escalated, ranging from anonymous messages to unsettling encounters. One evening, as Elijah was leaving the grocery store, he noticed a man lingering near his car. The man didn't say anything, but the way he watched Elijah sent a clear message: back off, or else. Elijah refused to be intimidated. He reported every incident, documenting each one meticulously. He knew the risks, but he also knew that backing down now would mean letting Wells and his allies win. And that was something he couldn't accept. The tension reached a boiling point when Elijah received a summons to testify in a public hearing. The prospect of speaking out in such a high-profile setting was daunting, but Elijah knew it was the next logical step in the fight for justice. The night before the hearing, he sat at the kitchen table, reviewing his notes while Micah worked on a school project nearby. "Are you nervous, Dad?" Micah asked, looking up from his poster board. Elijah considered the question for a moment before answering. "A little," he admitted. "But sometimes, doing the right thing means facing your fears. That's how we make a difference." Micah nodded, his eyes filled with admiration. "You're brave, Dad." The words stayed with Elijah as he prepared for the day ahead. He didn't feel brave, but he felt determined. And as he walked into the hearing room the next morning, the weight of Micah's words gave him the strength to face whatever came next. The courtroom was silent, the kind of stillness that made every movement, every rustle of paper, seem amplified. Elijah sat at the witness stand, his posture straight, his face calm but resolute. Across the room, Wells sat with his defense attorney, his once confident demeanor replaced by a thinly veiled desperation. The hearing had been grueling, with both sides presenting their cases, but as Elijah looked out at the panel of judges and the gathered spectators, he felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about Wells or even the corrupt network he represented. It was about accountability, about justice finally catching up to those who had evaded it for far too long. When Elijah spoke, his voice was steady, each word deliberate. He recounted the events with precision, painting a clear picture of the abuse, the corruption, and the ripple effects that had caused harm to countless families. He didn't embellish, didn't falter, and when he finished, the room remained silent for a moment before the lead judge thanked him and called for a recess. As Elijah stepped down, he felt the eyes of the room on him, some filled with gratitude, others with resentment, but he walked with his head held high. Outside the courtroom, Marcus waited, a wide grin on his face. "You nailed it in there," Marcus said, clapping Elijah on the shoulder. Elijah smiled faintly, the exhaustion of the day catching up to him. "Let's hope it's enough," he replied. Marcus nodded, his expression growing serious. "It will be. They can't ignore the truth anymore." The ruling came swiftly. Wells was convicted of multiple charges, including abuse of power and falsifying reports, and was sentenced to significant prison time. But it didn't end there. The Internal Affairs investigation, bolstered by the evidence Elijah and Marcus had brought forward, led to a massive overhaul within the department. Corrupt officers were dismissed, policies were restructured, and for the first time in years, the community began to feel a sense of hope that things could change. For Elijah, the victory was bittersweet. He had achieved what he set out to do, but it had come at a cost. His name and face were now widely recognized, and while many viewed him as a hero, others saw him as a traitor. He received hate mail and threats, but he also received messages of support, letters from people who had been victims of similar injustices, thanking him for giving them a voice. Each one reminded him why he had taken this fight on in the first place. At home, life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. Micah seemed lighter, his smile coming more easily now that the shadow of Wells had been lifted. One evening, as they sat together on the couch watching a movie, Micah turned to his father, his expression thoughtful. "Dad, are the bad guys all gone now?" Elijah hesitated, considering how best to answer. "Not all of them," he said finally. "But a lot of them are. And because of what we did, it's harder for the bad ones to hide. That's why it's important to keep standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." Micah nodded, his small hand reaching out to hold his father's. Elijah squeezed it gently, a sense of peace settling over him for the first time in months. He knew the fight wasn't over, there would always be more battles to fight, more injustices to confront, but for now, he allowed himself to breathe, to be present in this moment with his son. For Marcus, the exposé catapulted his career to new heights. He continued to use his platform to expose corruption and hold those in power accountable. But he never forgot the story that had changed everything, nor the friend who had trusted him with it. Marcus and Elijah remained close, their bond forged in the fire of their shared fight for justice. As for Wells, his fall from grace was as public as it was complete. Stripped of his badge and his freedom, he faced the consequences of his actions in a way he had never imagined. The man who had once believed himself untouchable now sat in a prison cell, forced to confront the reality of what he had done. Whether or not he felt remorse was a question Elijah chose not to dwell on. For him, the focus was on the lives that had been protected, the justice that had been served. This story is a powerful reminder that standing up to injustice isn't easy. It takes courage, resilience, and an unwavering belief in the power of truth. Elijah's journey wasn't just about holding one man accountable, it was about challenging an entire system, about fighting for a better future not just for his son, but for everyone. Now, let me ask you, what would you have done in Elijah's position? How far would you go to protect the people you love and stand up for what's right? This story challenges all of us to reflect on the power of our choices and the responsibility we have to confront injustice whenever we see it. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, I'd love to hear your perspective on this powerful journey. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories like this one, where we dive into complex, emotional narratives that challenge and inspire. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.